Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's Japan Society webinar. My name is Heidi Potter. As we work to try to deliver more of the Japan Society's business, education, and cultural programming online, I'm delighted to be able to welcome Frederic Aranda to talk about his work and about Japan. I first met Freddie at another crisis point. On that occasion, when he was organizing an exhibition and sale of some of his amazing photographs of kabuki, showing intimate backstage views as well as actors in full performance, in order to raise money for the Japan Society's Tohoku Earthquake Relief Fund. Frederic's portraiture is stunning, so I'm thrilled to have him share his work with us. But the story of how his background in Japanese studies has informed his later career is also fascinating. And I know we have some language students with us today, and you're all very, very welcome. We're going to start with some images, which Freddie will comment on. If you have any questions as he's talking, please type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'll try and ask them as we go along and pick up any others at the end if we don't get around to them. And at the end, there'll be some time for more questions. So please use the raise hand feature if you'd like to ask your question yourself, or continue to use the Q&A box, whichever's easier. Anyhow, let's get started. And first off, Freddie, I think you're planning to give us a flavor of who the professional you is now and the kind of work that you make.
Thank you, Heidi. And thanks everyone for logging in. It's nice to connect somehow during this really unusual time. And I'm in London right now, where it's not quite clear whether we're in lockdown or not, but I'm certainly enjoying this opportunity to talk about Japan. Hello everyone, I'm Frederic and I'm a photographer, and I'm a portrait photographer originally from Switzerland. I've been in the UK for 20 years and have not studied photography. I actually studied Japanese at university. I came to the UK to study a BA of Japanese at Oxford, and I've prepared a little presentation of some of my more general work before I go into the Japan-related work, just to give you a flavor of the kind of portraiture that I do. Here you can see Vivienne Westwood and her husband Andreas. This was a portrait commissioned by the brand a few years ago when they decided they wanted to put her husband more into the picture, so to speak, because he's taking on a bigger role at the brand. Prince Philip needs no introduction, really. I mean, a lot of these faces are very recognizable. And I don't normally like to comment too much on pictures because I prefer people to enjoy them themselves. But these are all a mix of commissions and also sometimes just me contacting the people directly, asking them if they would be interested in being photographed. For example, Miyazaki Hayao, who I admire greatly. And so a few years ago, I reached out to him via Studio Ghibli, and I was very happy to see that he was willing to let me come and visit. As well as Ben Stiller, for example, who I photographed for GQ Japan. Ando Tadao. This is Dina Asher-Smith, a British athlete, photographed for Harrods. And this was actually just a friend of mine from high school who wanted a good family portrait. And I turned up and this is what I saw. So this was the family portrait that we ended up taking. I also work with the Royal Ballet and other organizations. This was backstage at Swan Lake years ago. I also do fashion, and this is an editorial I did for Harper's Bazaar China, mixing my interest in fashion and also portraiture as group portraits, because that's one of my specialties. And telling a story via editorial is hugely stimulating, but especially if you can involve a large group of people. So that's one of the things that I'm probably the most well-known for, is my group portraits, which I do for magazines like Vanity Fair and Vogue, GQ. These are for Vanity Fair. and involve watchmakers in Switzerland, chefs for Harrods, members of a charitable organization for women's charities. And this was my first exhibition, Kosher Phase, back in 2009, my first solo exhibition about Orthodox Judaism, which is a whole other theme in my work. And this, to end this little kind of introduction, is probably the image that I took, which went around the world quickest, and which is most well known. This one went viral almost immediately because it was taken in 2011, just a few months after the tsunami, and it was Vogue's way of showing that Condé Nast, the company that owns Vogue, and Vogue stand behind Japan at the time when it was at its feet, and all of the editors of Vogue came together for an event in Japan, and I was asked to go photograph them all together for the first time ever. And this was actually quite a Mission Impossible shoot, which I'll come back to later. So that's the little introduction. This on my screensaver, by the way, is Naomi Watanabe. For those of you who don't know her, she is a remarkable performer in Japan. But anyway, let me go now into my Japan-related work, because, as I said, I come from Switzerland, and my interest in Japan started as a child. I went to an international school in Geneva where many of my friends were Japanese. And so from an early age, I was exposed to Japanese culture, and managed to convince my friends' mothers to prepare me bento boxes every day of the week at school. So I had a rota of Japanese moms preparing bento boxes for me at school and primary school. And then by the time I reached secondary school, I decided I wanted to learn Japanese. And so in 1987, I went for the first time to Japan. And I went for an organized tour of sort of most tourist sites. And these are some of the pictures that I took at the time when I was 17. We went to various places such as the Kasuga Shrine in Nara, Nijo Castle, and I was just fascinated by this architecture, and not just that, but everything that I saw that was just so removed from anything that I knew in Switzerland. The Tordaiji in Nara. So when I got back, I was still in high school, and I got back to Geneva, and I made this lino print as a result of what I saw in Japan, and just the feeling of confusion that I felt of, all these layers of different textures and patterns and the architecture. And that at the bottom left is me over here, just kind of lost in all of this. And for me, this was the start of a long relationship with Japan, which has lasted over 20 years until now. And so I applied to study Japanese at Oxford and got in. And then in my first year, I went to Japan for a 4-month exchange program at Kansai Gakuin Daigaku, which is otherwise known as Kangaku, in the Kansai region. And then just started documenting more of what I saw. So this was the cherry blossom season, Tamajakushi, the tadpoles, and just going around shrines and temples again, and just capturing things that I saw. At the time, I was quite influenced by a lot of Japanese poetry and literature that I read, because at Oxford, the emphasis was really quite literary, So as well as learning the language, we also studied a lot of the culture, including the classic works of literature like the Manyoshu, the Kokinshu. We read the Hojoki. We read all sorts of, we read Makura no Soshi, we read all sorts of things. And I was kind of wandering around Japan in awe of all of this, with all these classical images in my head, and finding poetry anywhere that I looked. And it was at this time, actually, at Kangaku, that I made a friend who was willing to put up with me as a photographer to do photo shoots. And so I went from just observing everything around me to finally being able to get someone to pose for me in Japan. And her name is Madoka, and she was also a student at Kangaku who I met through the art club there because I did a lot of painting at the time. And so we did a few pictures around campus where she was always mixed in with the trees. And so for me at the time, I was very interested in trees visually because I looked at them almost as a metaphor for human emotions and feelings, and the shape to me was always quite significant of a tree. So I always tried to echo the human body with the trees, and she was willing to play along with it and to go along with it and do all sorts of interesting poses and to interact with the landscape, which for me was great. And then I learned how to develop and print the pictures by hand. So I started doing that at Kangaku, where there was a photographic darkroom, but also then later when I got back to Oxford after this 4-month program. I also, during that time, went to Kyoto and saw some maiko, or geishas, and was obviously fascinated by the kimono at the time and the wigs, the hair and everything. And so when I got back to Switzerland during the summer holiday, I decided that I wanted to make a sculpture of a geisha. Well, we call her the geisha, or la geisha in French, because that's what my mom baptized her. But actually, it was a mix of images that you've just seen of kimonos, also with a picture I saw of a kabuki actor called Bando Tamasaburo, who specializes in female role types. He's an onnagata actor. And so, but obviously my mom didn't know about that, so she just calls her the geisha because that's how people would perceive her at the time in Europe. And as you can see, I made her with some, I think it's called chicken wire in English. It's just metallic wire that I pieced together and then covered in plaster, and then I put a mask on it. And she lived on our balcony in the terrace in Geneva and terrified all the neighbors every time they looked out their window. So we got into a lot of trouble because people started complaining. But La Geisha was, I was very proud of her. And the aim was to make the sculpture so that I could then photograph it around different places in Geneva. So my sister and I, we carried her around. She was life size, as tall as me. And we carried her around, photographed her all over the place. And then we had to get rid of her because the neighbors kept complaining that she was scary on the balcony. And eventually, because the council didn't want to pick her up, we ended up throwing her in Lake Geneva. So that was a bad day for the swans. This is me during my fresh off the boat, arriving in Japan on my year out at Waseda University, which was in my 4th year. I got accepted on an exchange program at Waseda, and because I didn't know anyone in Tokyo yet at the time, I was just photographing myself. And so I did a lot of self-portraits at that time in the very beginning. And I'm here standing outside of the Kabukiza, which was the old version before they renovated it. I hadn't been to see Kabuki yet, but I had read a lot of Kabuki back at Oxford. And so this was me kind of hovering around the Kabukiza at the time. And this is in Shinjuku, just doing more self-portraits. One of the first things I did when I got to Japan was I went to this place called Obasute, which fascinated me because it's the subject of Japanese folktale. The folktale is called Obasute Yama or Ubasute Yama, or yeah, I think those are the two main kind of versions of the name. Obasute means to abandon an old woman or abandon your grandmother, or just granny dumping in modern terms. And this was the subject of a folktale which arrived in Japan from India via China with Buddhism in the 6th century. And there's no evidence that this actually happened, but the story goes that there was this mountain in the Nagano prefecture, which is this one right here that you can see, where back in the day, anyone who was over the age of 70 was taken there by their children to be abandoned. And I found this fascinating because it's it rings true in many ways even today. You know, I think growing up and leaving home and going to university and just becoming an independent adult, you feel like in a way you are kind of abandoning your parents a lot of the time. And I think that this is why it resonated with me also, because this was the time when I left Switzerland to go to university, and I found that I was growing further apart from my family. Even though we're very close and we keep in touch almost daily, you know, for me it was quite a big shift. And so I was fascinated by this tale, which was based on the story that apparently a ruler at the time in Japan just couldn't stand old people. And so there was an edict that they all had to be abandoned on top of this mountain to die. And there are various variations of this tale, but one of them that I particularly liked was that a man took his mother there and abandoned her, and then she told him before he left that if he could see the moon that night, she would be watching the moon as well, so they would be connected via the moon if they were both looking at it at the same time. So going back one slide, I was particularly pleased to see the moon hovering around that day when I went. And because I didn't have anyone else to photograph, I did a few self-portraits there as well, which are a little bit embarrassing to show, but this is part of my development at the time. So here we are.
Freddie, we've got a question from Paolo who's asking whether you can explain a little bit about the kind of camera you're using and any advice on taking this kind of photograph.
So this is just shot with a regular analog film camera. It was just a 35mm camera with a portrait lens on a tripod, really very straightforward, and using a timer. So then I realized, okay, I can't just keep photographing myself looking ridiculous, hovering around. I need to photograph other people. So at Waseda, I started to photograph my teachers and my classmates, and they got kind of sick of me, but they put up with it for a while. This was my Japanese language teacher in Japanese class, and my friend Laquan, who was an American exchange student also in my class. And I just started snapping everybody that I could and doing all these little impromptu group shots with teachers and classmates at the time. But then what happened, there was a big break for me, which was that I decided that I needed to find people who were willing to be photographed rather than accidental victims. And so I got a job at a Japanese modeling agency called Friday as a photographer. And it was a stroke of luck. I just met this wonderful person called Junko Murakami, who actually is a phenomenal woman in Japan. She doesn't like the limelight, but she is credited for having introduced foreign models into Japan in the 80s. She was the person who actually first had the idea to bring models from abroad to Japan. So she started that whole trend. And then by the time I got to Japan, this is in 2001 or 2, she had scaled back to Japanese models because she decided that she wanted to promote Japanese standards of beauty in the media. And she thought that it was a shame that Japanese magazines were all using foreign models as examples of what is beautiful. So she started using exclusively Japanese models. And I got a job photographing them for their portfolios. And so this I did in parallel to my studies at Waseda, and I was able to do day after day of just lining up all the models and setting up a little studio corner in the agency where they would all just come for a 15-minute slot. And this included children as well, because this agency really had a broad range of models, from women to children to more mature people, men, a massive men's division. And so this was really a crash course for me, because I had to suddenly deliver in 15-minute time slots. I had to be able to get something out of somebody who wasn't necessarily going to like me, So these people, especially kids, they're brutally honest, but still manage to interact with them. And that's when I realized, okay, I can actually do this. And I feel like I can capture something even in a short amount of time. These are some contact sheets from those shoots, which I still have. And examples of how these pictures were used on Nengajo, or just greeting cards, Happy New Year cards. And this is an example of a rota that we had in a single day. I had all these models lined up to come in, each for about 15 to 20 minutes. And we shot them on rotation. And as you can see, they're all Japanese people. And I got to really experience a broad range of different people from all walks of life in Japan. And it was really quite an incredible privilege to be able to meet and get to know some of them. Some of them are still friends to this day. And I'm still friends with the director of this agency. And one of the models who you saw previously, she is actually now my agent, because she became a booker in the agency, and then she decided to head the artist division, and then they asked me if I wanted to be represented by them as a photographer years later. So I mean, this happened by a stroke of luck, just through meeting the right person. Actually, he's right here. I don't know if you can see my mouse hovering. This is Masaki, who said, oh, would you like to come to the agency and meet Junko-san? And so that's how we got started.
We've got quite a few more questions at the moment, and one from Nicolo specifically about how you make someone comfortable when you've got such a short time, and to create, still be able to create dynamic photographs.
Well, it's all about communication, I think, and obviously the fact that I had a bit of Japanese skill there was very helpful. I don't think I could have done this without speaking Japanese. I'm not saying that my Japanese is excellent, but it was enough to get people amused, or to be able to interact with them, and so I think it's mainly about the communication. But then also you've got to have a point of view, you've got to have a vision, and immediately be able to find an access point to a portrait. So I like to think that I can always find one thing at least to like about somebody. Whether it's their smile or their eyes or something. And so that's always the entry point into a portrait, is that if you decide quickly what it is you like about somebody, then that's how you approach the portrait, is through that. And so then you can start that way, and you have to be very quick and instinctive about it. So as you can see, I took the models out around Tokyo as well. And then while I was there, they also opened the division for half Japanese models, which actually, again, Junko-san is credited for starting this new trend in Japan 20 years ago, when she decided that she wanted to explore various different iterations of what it is to be Japanese. And so she started recruiting people who were half British, half Japanese, as you can see here. This is his sister, half Brazilian, half Japanese, of which, there is a big population. Half French, half Japanese. And these range from, children to adults. And so this is actually quite a profound, it was quite profound for me to experience this, because you see he's half Indian, half Japanese, and then the other two are half Brazilian, half Japanese. So I mean, that in itself was an amazing school of life, just working in this agency and getting to meet all these people, to step outside of the bubble of Waseda and university. And then here, this was actually like my first paid usage of a picture that I had taken. I don't know if you can see the mouse. Can you see it?
No.
No. Oh, hang on. Well, anyway, uh, right above the Toshiba logo there's two pictures. Those two are mine. The others are not mine, but anyway, and they're so small. But for me, I was so proud of this at the time. Again, they're in the bottom right corner there. For me, I was just so excited. You know, I have like 10 copies of this thing. I sent them home to my mom. You know, for me, like I was like, wow, finally something, a photo I've taken is being used by somebody else for something, you know. So for me, this is when I started realizing all the possibilities. In parallel to this job, I also had a job at the Kabukiza Theater, which again was a pure stroke of luck, but I was hired as a translator, or more specifically as an English earphone guide, by the man in the middle in the checkered shirt, Paul Griffith, who I believe is probably listening today. If you are, hello. And he gave me a chance, him alongside Rachel Payne, who was my teacher at Oxford. They both put me forward for this to be an English earphone guide, where I got to go every month to the Kabukiza Theater. And this was a dream come true, by the way, to watch Kabuki plays and to write commentaries, or to write translations and commentaries, which I then recorded and which were then broadcast during the performance as live earphone commentaries. And so this as well was just another seminal experience for me, where I got to watch Kabuki nonstop for a whole year. I got to go to rehearsals and to watch it. And I went to see everything because I could obviously just go in for free, thanks to these people. And this is the only picture I have of the whole team. From Asahi Kaisetsu Jigyo, which is the company that was providing these earphone guides. And I mean, it was literally a dream come true that I got to do this. And then I got to write my thesis about Kabuki the following year in my final year at Oxford. And I didn't take any pictures of Kabuki actors at that time, but I did get to watch unlimited amounts of Kabuki, and I got this signed autograph. In the middle is Ichikawa Danjiro the 12th, who is now sadly gone, but he probably still is my all-time favorite Kabuki actor. Really quite a presence. I encourage everyone to look him up. He's the father of the current Ichikawa Ebizo. And on the left, there you have the signature of Nakamura Kantaro, the second, who is now known as Nakamura Kankuro the sixth. Because as Kabuki actors grow in seniority, they change names in these very elaborate name-giving ceremonies called shume. And on the right-hand side, Nakamura Shichinosuke II. So for me, this was a big deal that I managed to get this. And I went back to Oxford full of beans and just very happy to have had this incredible year in Japan. So now the final part is, when I got to Oxford, I decided, okay, now I need to step up the photography, because I've had this incredible experience in this modeling agency where I was put to the test, and I felt like I had succeeded, and I had been able to deliver powerful portraits of all these individual people in a short space of time. What could I do if I had more time? So I asked my classmates at Oxford if they wouldn't mind posing for me for an entire day. And at the time, I was also very interested in starting taking group portraits, which is extremely challenging technically, but also conceptually. And it's just a nightmare for a lot of photographers. So a lot of photographers just don't do them. Because if you look at magazines like Vanity Fair and the Annie Leibovitz group portraits, I mean, I grew up looking at those portraits and admiring them. And I grew up thinking that they had all been done in camera, and that all those people like Sophia Loren and Catherine Deneuve and Vanessa Redgrave had all met and were all in the same room at the same time. And so I decided I wanted to do this kind of portrait as well, where I could get all these people in the same room at the same time, making this shoot an event in itself, because that's the interesting thing, is the story. Like, what are they all saying to each other? How are they all interacting? And this was before Photoshop. So I had to get it all in camera. I had to get everyone sharp, in focus, the lighting uniform. There is literally zero Photoshop in this picture. And for me, this was a big milestone, that I was able to capture something like this technically correctly, but also to do it in a way that I felt the composition was dynamic on several levels. So you have people on different levels and dynamic lines running through, overarching throughout the picture. And so for me, this, I felt like, was a new chapter in my photography, where I came back from Japan and I was full of ambition, and I was able to start this new kind of photography. And then this was another one I did of all of my teachers at Oxford in the Japanese department. Although now I see that one of them is missing. Brian Powell is missing, so I don't know where he was that day. But I asked them all to pose for a group portrait, and as you can see, technically there are some issues there, because this was before Photoshop. But for me, it was also about getting all these people together. And then, because I felt like they had been such great teachers and tutors, I invited the Vice Chancellor of the university, Sir Colin Lucas, to join. He's the one in the middle on the left there. And standing behind him is Ira, the receptionist from the institute where I had my Japanese lessons, who I thought deserved to be in the portrait as well, because she was the most fabulous, glamorous woman who would always welcome everybody and make them feel so welcome at the institute. And I remembered how nice she had made me feel during my interviews at Oxford. So I thought, I want to include her in this portrait that brings together people who I admire. Which brings me to this portrait of Vogue again. So Vogue needed a picture which was to be done in camera without any photoshopping. And so they asked me to come to Japan to take this portrait, because I had this experience doing group portraits without any Photoshop, as you've seen in the previous two slides. And the reason why there was no time for Photoshop here is because the picture was to be taken on a Friday afternoon in Japan, and had to be released half an hour after it had been shot to Getty Images, the agency, so that it could be released worldwide to the press, to send out this important message about Vogue supporting the Japanese fashion industry during the tsunami days. And so they needed a photographer who could come and get everything right without any need for elaborate restructuring of the picture in Photoshop or any photoshopping in general. And so I was very lucky to be asked to do this. So the way I proceeded was to make a drawing in advance, and this was months in advance. I started to research all the different editors that were going to be involved. There's all the editors from all the different editions internationally of Vogue came for this. And so they're all really incredible women, and I obviously wanted them all to be put to their advantage. And so I researched each person individually and decided how they would shine best, each individually. And so I seated them accordingly. And then we made plans with Vogue. After I had made this drawing, they made kind of these diagrams to see how we would produce this shoot, So we actually thought about the set and the blocks that they'd be sitting on. And then also, because there was no room for error, we had to get everything lit properly and sharp, in focus. We had to measure everything. And so we made all these pretty elaborate diagrams of where each person was going to sit, so that by the time the editors actually showed up, all they had to do was to just sit down and look great and shine. So before the shoot happened, I showed up 12 hours in advance and I set it all up to the millimeter, you know, and I got a group of photography students to come in and pose to pretend to be Anna Wintour and all these other people, and to sit there for a few hours while I tested everything exhaustively on them. And the whole process was just rehearsed again and again. And luckily, by the time the actual editors arrived, everything went incredibly smoothly, and I was able to just focus on making them feel good and making them feel comfortable. So that was my first time a picture of mine went viral, and it was an unforgettable experience. And it was all thanks to my links with Japan.
Freddie, we've got a question here from Paul Griffith, your old friend, who says hi and asks whether you ever get inspiration from old master paintings, especially those that feature groups of people, Rembrandt, Van Dyck and others.
Oh, absolutely. Jericho, Rembrandt, Van Dyck, a lot of them, yes, absolutely. And also, pardon me, also a lot of woodblock prints, to be honest, Hokusai, Hiroshige, a lot of their, I have all the books and I look at them all the time. So here was just a few months ago, I was invited back to Tokyo to photograph the editorial team of Vogue Japan this time in its entirety for their 20th anniversary sort of commemoration. So I got to do that. And then all the assistants joined in as well. So that became a massive picture. But this is more of a family portrait. So it's less important for them to all be posing. It's okay for them to be closer to each other because it's a family portrait and there's no need for them to be divas, although some of them are. Anyway, then some more examples of work I've done with Vogue. This was 2AM, a Korean K-pop band, because Vogue has very kindly believed in my ability to bring people together in a group or to just photograph people individually, full stop. So they've given me a lot of opportunities, including meeting athletes like Takeshi Matsuda, who I photographed here for Vogue in 2012. Mother and daughter, Yayako and Kara Uchida. Kitty Spencer, more recently in London. So the shoots don't always have to happen in Japan. They can happen anywhere, really. And this was Choco from Line App, the mascot. We also did a Vogue shoot with her. So I got to spend a whole day in the studio with Choco, which was actually quite fun. I also do shoots with other Japanese magazines. So this was Richesse magazine, a Hearst publication, where I got to go to Kyoto to meet a geisha called Mamerio, who then became a friend and who I photographed again since. So for me, this was another wonderful opportunity to experience another side of Japanese culture, again, a traditional side, but fascinating nonetheless. And this was a picture taken just last year in Kyoto, in the Gion district. And then also I get to photograph some pretty incredible young performers. So Naomi Watanabe for Numero Tokyo. We went to Milan and spent a whole day together. And she was there to promote a brand of bags called Furla. And we even had ice cream. It was great. I work also with GQ Japan. This was a cover of a watch supplement that we did. And here is an editorial which we did, which I actually love. It's a fashion editorial, but it's more of a portrait editorial as far as I'm concerned, because the idea was to photograph the designer of each brand with models wearing the clothes from the brand. So, and to make them actually do something. So on the left, you see Chitose Abe from Sakai, for example, who's done incredibly well worldwide, you know, and this is a rare picture of her being actually quite relaxed. And then other designers interacting with the models. On the left, you have Mihara Yasuhiro, for example. We had a little snack in his studio, and I was just photographing it. And Phenomenon brand. I also get to photograph some incredible football players. So this was Atsuto Uchida, who I went to Germany with to photograph when he was at Schalke team in 2011. I got to do a book about him, actually, which was published by Gentosha in Japan. So football is totally removed from my life, you know, but why not? And actually, I connect with people regardless. So that was a remarkable experience for me. And here is Tomoyasu Hote in the middle. You may all know him. He's a very well-known guitarist, electric guitarist and musician who I hired for a campaign for Huntsman of Savile Row, because I thought it'd be nice to spice things up a bit and to get a gentleman with a bit of swagger. And we also photographed him for his album cover for his album Paradox in 2017. Another form of stringed instrument. This is the shamisen, actually, and I've recently been very fortunate, thanks to a friend called Kaneko-san, Miki Kaneko, who very kindly introduced me to several people in Japan in the performing arts. And I was very fortunate to meet Toyozawa Choichiro, who is a shamisen player backstage in his dressing room at Tokyo's Kabukiza Theater in January. You may all know shamisen is a 3-string instrument, which is probably the most important instrument in kabuki and bunraku theaters, because it is the shamisen player who often determines the timing of the actors and will also sometimes fill in the space between the actions. So shamisen is fundamental in both theater forms. And Choichiro-san belongs to the Gidayu school of music, which is a style originally created by Takemoto Gidayu in Osaka for the Bunraku puppet theater in the late 17th century. And so I got to go backstage and meet him, which was a wonderful experience. Which leads me on to Bunraku, another of, this is probably one of my favorite things. I mean, kabuki is my favorite, but bunraku is equal, pretty much up there with it, to bunraku puppet theater, also known as the ningyo joruri. Ningyo is puppet, and joruri is a combination of chanting and shamisen, which you've just seen. It dates from the beginning of the 17th century, was founded in Osaka. And I got to go to the National Bunraku Theater in Osaka to meet Yoshida Minoshiro, who you can see there in the middle, manipulating the right hand of this character called Tairano Tomomori, who they're rehearsing this scene from Yoshitsune and the Thousand Cherry Trees, which is one of the top 3 plays in kabuki and bunraku. And Tomomori is an evil character. It's a historical play based loosely on actual historical facts, but it departs from them because Tomomori was supposed to have died already at this point. But in this play, he's still alive and he's causing trouble. And so the puppets are 3/4 of the human size, and they require 3 puppeteers to manipulate in full view of the audience, which is fascinating because you suspend your disbelief and you just stop seeing the puppeteers and you focus on these puppets, which actually express a distillation of human emotions and have brought me to tears many times. I mean, I didn't think it was possible to cry watching puppets, but it was actually. And as you can see, there's 3 operators. One of them specializes in the right hand. He's called the omozukai. That's Yoshida-san. There's one who specializes in the left arm, and there's a third who specializes in the legs. And bunraku has also been given the status of intangible cultural heritage by UNESCO. So I strongly recommend that people go and check this out. It's also often performed at the National Theater in Tokyo, so the Kokuritsu Gekijo. And this is backstage at the National Theater. Again, the same trio rehearsing a scene from Sugawara Denju Tenarai Kagami, which is Sugawara and the Secrets of Calligraphy. And this is a different puppet now. It's a different role type. It's a Wagoto fashion. It's a more romantic, gentle character type. His name is Sakura Maru. And he's obviously more gentle and has more realistic actions. So that's Bunraku for you, which is just a dream come true for me. And finally, Kabuki. As you know, I got to work at the Kabukiza for a year, but I didn't take any pictures. But then I was very fortunate to be able to start photographing Kabuki when they finally came to London. Finally, when they came to London in the early to mid 2000s to put on performances at the Barbican and at Sadler's Wells. And this is the picture of Onoe Kikunosuke V in Twelfth Night, which is an adaptation by Ninagawa Yukio, which his set designs are always really well known for being exquisite. And here, Kikunosuke is playing the role of Sebastian and is crossing a pair of elegant bridges in a Japanese garden filled with blossoms. So for those who don't know Kabuki, it's also a UNESCO intangible cultural heritage art form, and it originates from the start of the 17th century, coinciding with the birth of the Tokugawa shogunate. It's a full assault on the senses, and actually so much so that Sergei Eisenstein, the film director, described it as a monism of ensemble. In other words, a grand total provocation of the human brain, where you have sound, movement, space, and voice, all as elements of equal significance. And whereas in Western theater, you often subsume aesthetic practices for a narrative, in Kabuki, aesthetic practices are all significant in their own right. And so it's like a tidal wave of information hitting your senses. And Ka in Kabuki means song, Bu means dance, and Ki means skill or acting skills. So all of those things have equal weight. At Sadler's Wells, I managed to go backstage thanks to Paul Griffith and Ronald Kawai and Taiko Hishinuma, who is hopefully listening today. I photographed everything that was just there in that dressing room. This is the makeup table, and kesho makeup is quite a complicated affair. Oils and waxes are put on the face, and then white powder is dissolved in water, or it's called oshiroi, and then powdered rouge, tonoko, and a range of highlights are applied with liners, brushes, pads, and sponges, which you can see. This is Ichikawa Ennosuke, at the time known as Ichikawa Kamejiro II. So on top of the oil base, wax is often applied to facial hair, such as eyebrows, to smooth it out before white makeup goes on. And to save time, however, some actors just shave their eyebrows completely, just to make it a lot easier. Here you can see that the layers of white makeup obliterate the actor's individual features, such as the mouth. So this allows him to paint on a new shape and color that conforms to the role type that he's going to play. And this is him in full costume after getting ready. He is backstage at Sadler's Wells and ready to make an entrance in the dance drama called Kasane. And although these are modern surroundings, this costume that he wears is appropriate for the work's premiere in 1823. So you always feel like you're transported back in time. Ichikawa Ebizo, another great actor, waiting in the wings. And here he plays the handsome Yoemon in the dance drama Kasane. He is a romantic villain, or Iroaku, and on the outside seems gentle and caring, but actually possesses a cruel and immoral streak. He is a dispossessed samurai, and The rough growth of hair on his pate, mushiri, is typical of these characters' hairstyles. It suggests a sinister and violent nature. Here, Yoemon, or Ebizo, is in the last few minutes of Kasane, and having murdered his lover, he shields himself with a straw mat and makes a run for it. But as much as he tries to get away, Kasane's ghost keeps pulling him back. In the gory climax of Kasane, Yoemon murders his lover with a sickle and strikes a famous pose on the Hanemichi Bridge, which you can see here, with the weapon in his mouth. In such stop-motion poses, or mie, male characters sometimes cross their eyes. Ebizo, for his female role in the Wisteria Maiden, which was part of the double bill, Fuji Musume, he is applying black liner to the thin, delicate eyebrows, quite different from those of the male character Yoemon. The actor's head is also bound tightly in a long piece of cloth, or habutae. Here you can see Ebizo reflecting. Once all his makeup is complete, he takes a moment to collect his thoughts. It's at this stage that many actors will fully take on the role that they're about to play. Ebizo being dressed. Several assistants help the actors to dress. For female roles such as the Wisteria Maiden, the wide and heavy sash, or obi, would be impossible to put on and tie by oneself. The design often reflects the role, as you can see here. And here he is on stage minutes or seconds rather before the curtain will go up. The black-clad stage assistants, or kurogo, help with the finishing touches. The maiden will carry a branch of purple flowers over one shoulder. I also got commissioned by a magazine called Richesse to photograph 3 generations of this most incredible, illustrious family of actors. On the left, you have Kataoka Nizaemon. In the middle, you have Kataoka Sennosuke, and on the right, Kataoka Takataro, who are all 3 generations of the same family. And this is in one of the corridors at the Kabukiza. And this is Takataro-san backstage after a performance 2 years ago. Here we have Nakamura Kotaro, another fantastic actor. And this was taken just minutes before he was due on the stage. So he's fully dressed and ready. And he will be playing the role of Yae in Onna Kurumabiki. Just a few months ago in January, I was very privileged to go watch a performance at the Asakusa Kokaido, where Ichikawa Emino performed Takemi Nakata, the god of the Suwa shrine. Here, the action of swinging the hair, or keburi, is one of the showcase pieces of kabuki, and it is a dazzling, energetic display of the character's supernatural strength. It's also a great physical feat for the actor because of the weight of the wig and the costume, and this has to be repeated every night throughout the run. So you can see him just going on and on and on. And finally, these are 3 young kabuki actors who I went to photograph backstage in the rehearsal space for the acrobatics at the Kabukiza. And they are caught mid-flight rehearsing tombo somersaults. These are performed during spectacular fight scenes with remarkable precision, as you can see. And whereas most kabuki actors are born into acting dynasties and inherit the kabuki tradition, these 3 men are proof that actors from the general population, people from general population, can also become kabuki actors. If they wish to devote their life to their art, they can actually go to training schools, and all of them are now full-time kabuki actors.
Freddie, we've got lots and lots of questions, so maybe we'll try and go through some of them, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Herb is asking, says you're very modest about your Japanese language ability, but don't you feel that without having fluent Japanese, you wouldn't have been able to get some of the jobs and some of the opportunities that you've shown us today?
Well, there's fluent and there's fluent. You know, I'll never be able to speak like a Japanese person, and I've come to terms with that very early on. So I'm quite happy being able to communicate what I need to communicate, and so yes, I can do that, and I believe that that's been definitely a key to being able to work in Japan for sure.
And people are very interested in the techniques, your photography techniques. And do you ever use Photoshop? And how do you use it? And what kind of gear do you use when you're taking
Of
images?
course, yeah. I mean, it's Photoshop is just another tool that you have to use in your arsenal. I think you should be able to use Photoshop, and I will go to it always to adjust lighting and color. And I tend to have a general rule, which is that I think that photoshopping is acceptable if it's a range of techniques that would be available in darkroom, photographic darkroom techniques as well. So, you know, to do with lighting and color. And then it gets more complicated once you look at manipulating images. But the fact is that I'm not a reportage or news photographer, so it doesn't matter if I manipulate images because they're not going to be used as news in a newspaper. You know, so my aim is to make people look iconic and beautiful, and to express something about them. So if I need to use a tool like Photoshop to do it, then I will. But you saw pictures of the three actors doing somersaults just now. None of that was photoshopped.
Mm-hmm. And linked to that, there are a few questions about your photo heroes. Somebody is asking about how you see today's Japanese contemporary photography, and what do you think about people who are seen as important like Daido Moriyama and so on? Any thoughts on Japanese contemporary photographic scene?
Yes, I mean, I grew up looking at the work of Eiko Hosoe, for example, Daido Moriyama, Araki to a certain extent, although I'm not the biggest fan, but I do appreciate his contribution, and I see why he is significant. There are lots of great photographers in Japan. Japan has produced some fantastic photographers and photography, and which is another reason why it was so exciting for me to be in Tokyo, to be in that pool of photographers. You know, so absolutely, I think that they definitely have a different point of view from us in Europe and the States, and I see a lot more Japanese names come up in awards. You see a lot of young Japanese photographers win awards now. I think it's all becoming a lot more fluid worldwide. So you're seeing a lot more exchange between Japan and the outside world, for sure.
Another question from Armandine this time, but did you study the history of foreign photography in Japan? She's writing a dissertation about it and wondered if there's a place that you experienced in a particular way, sort of from historical photographs, for example.
Do you mean historical photographs taken by non-Japanese people in Japan? Or?
Yes, yeah. I think that's what she means anyhow, yeah.
Well, I'm not such a great historian, to be honest. I do go to a lot of exhibitions. I've been going to a lot of exhibitions about tintypes and daguerreotypes, and I love all these old techniques. And Japan does come up quite a lot in those old photographs. And I definitely grew up looking at a lot of them. So yes, they have influenced me, but I'm also influenced by painting and sculpture and all sorts of other things. So for me, actually, I would say that I go to just as many photography shows as art exhibitions, really.
Right. And what else have we got here? Let me have a lot of people saying thank you very much. But what do you how much they've enjoyed seeing your photographs of Japan and being able to travel when we're all shut up in our homes. Somebody's asking whether you've had any experience with on the flip side of kabuki, experience with something like the Takarazuka review.
Yeah, so actually I lived in Takarazuka. For those 4 months that I was at Kangaku, I actually lived in, more precisely, Takarazuka Minamiguchi, which I thought was the best place on earth. It was just on the foot of these mountains. But it was, yes, I got to go see quite a lot of that. And I mean, I haven't actively sought out opportunities to photograph them, although I do appreciate what they do as well. But I'll confess that kabuki is much more to my taste. You know, I think that it's much more of a total immersion into the senses, and the experience is for me more stimulating.
I think I know there are still a few questions that we haven't had a chance to ask, but we are sort of running to the end of our hour, which is very sad. I'm sure we could carry on, a lot of us could carry on listening to you and seeing your wonderful pictures for ages. Actually, I'm really thrilled. I must share with, if I can put my screen back again. Hang on a second.
Well, I hope it was useful, and that you could take something from this. It's always weird to look back on things that were done 20 years ago, but I think that it was a nice opportunity for me as well to just reassess what I've done relating to Japan specifically.
Yes, no, it's been great, and yes, I got in the post. Oops, you can't see it because of my background,
wow.
but my photo one of your picture of Ian McKellen you took, which Freddie and a whole group of other photographers are have through Trace Portfolio, and I'm going to put a link in the chat now. Selling, people who don't normally sell their prints of their work are selling prints of their work. I don't know how many photographers there are there, but many well-known names in photography are offering an image each for people to purchase in aid of refuge and crisis at this time, to support people who are, really feeling the negative effects of our current situation. So if you do,
it's an initiative by a collective called Trace to raise money for refuge and crisis, two charities dealing with homelessness and domestic violence. And in the first 10 days, we raised £50,000, which is just unbelievable. And all the pictures are sold for £50 each, and all the money goes to charity. So I've been asked to contribute an image, and I contributed my portrait of Ian McKellen, and over the moon that this image could be put to good use.
And it's a privilege to have it in my house. And I look at it and feel happy.
I'll sign it for you next time I see you.
I'll hold you to that, Freddie. And one last comment. Obviously, you with your group portraits, with social distancing, that's proving quite a challenge for you. But I saw that you'd been doing a group portrait on Zoom recently.
Yes, I've got it right here, actually.
Maybe you could share some tips on how people can tackle group portraiture for the first time, and maybe if people follow your tips, they can share them later, perhaps.
Yeah, let me just quickly show it to you. This is can you see it there? Mm-hmm. This is a group portrait via Zoom, actually, of a family, the family of Esther Calms, who is a Holocaust survivor. She came to the UK via kinder transport at the end of the Holocaust and built a life in the UK. And this is her entire family, all 4 generations. And we would never have been able to get them all together were it not for modern technology, because they all live in different countries and continents. So we were supposed to do a shoot of her family in the UK, which would have been much smaller, but because everything's been put on hold and we are in lockdown, at least I think we are, then we were able to get them all to log on from all around the world. And this is the resulting group portrait. So I'm very happy about this.
Oh no, it's fabulous, and yeah, maybe if people do their own group portraits, they can share them and tag you at Frederic Aranda and at Japan Society London, and we'd love to see any pictures people are inspired to see. Yeah, but Freddie, thank you so much. It's been a super privilege. I'm echoing all the people who've texted in instead of their questions, just to say thank you and how much they've loved seeing your pictures. But I've wanted to have this conversation with you for a while, so I'm glad that. And to hear from you a bit more about your background. So thank you so much for joining us today.
It's absolutely my pleasure. And thank you all so much for listening and being so patient with me. And I wish you guys all the best. Stay safe. And hopefully we'll meet again.
I'm sure we will. The day will come. Thanks, Freddie.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.